Hi, I'm Andrew Rodriguez, and welcome to PsychoBible. In continuing my series addressing various topics with a theology of the body frame, today I'll be combining a few topics: abortion, euthanasia, and antinatalism. All three of these are evidence of our culture of death, resulting from the fall and the rupture of body and spirit. Let's start with euthanasia. In the US, we mostly talk about it as like a hypothetical, but in several countries, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Colombia, Canada, it is legal. And assisted suicide is legal in many other states, even in the US. Of course, there are restrictions. The person must have an illness, physical or psychological, that causes great suffering. Now, normally the patients have something like terminal cancer, but cases of mental health disorders are growing. One case that stood out to me in 2013 was of a Belgian female-to-male transsexual named Nathan Verhelst, who opted for euthanasia after being dissatisfied with her sex reassignment surgeries. She wasn't dying, she just had mutilated her body, and she would rather die than tolerate life in a mutilated body that just didn't fit her expectations of what life would be like after all this sex reassignment surgeries. That's just tragic. The idea is that they're providing them with the ability to die with dignity. But we have the wrong understanding of dignity. The world's view of dignity is to be the one in control. We don't see the dignity in suffering. Now, this lust for control and the avoidance of suffering is precisely what drives abortion. What are the arguments for abortion? We say it's because there's a debate over when life begins, or when personhood begins. But when politicians on the left refuse to vote for a bill that would have protected newborns that survived abortion, it became abundantly clear that the question of personhood or when life begins is just a smokescreen. What has paved the way to abortion is denial of the reality of the purpose of our genitals. Genitals are for generating. This is no mystery. We know this. Life begins whenever there is a union. In this case, a union of the sperm and the egg. We're in denial not out of ignorance, but out of a disgust, a revulsion. We don't like this reality. Why? It all comes down to suffering. We do not want the economic burden of a child. We decline giving the child for adoption because we do not want to suffer the responsibility of caring for the child for 9 months and undergoing labor, which could be painful and full of risks. Some women are in dire straits. The pregnancy was unexpected. Maybe she was raped, though we all know that this is the least frequent reason women seek abortion. Maybe she was engaged sexually with a boyfriend whom she believed would stay with her, but he abandoned her sometime after the conception. Some women they cannot fathom having the strength to endure the responsibility of motherhood. They don't believe they can offer a child a life worth living, that free of suffering and pain and trial. It would just be easier not to even have the child. The suffering they anticipate for themselves and their child, it overwhelms them. I would never make light of this, but we also must appreciate the gravity of the choice a woman is making to destroy the union she has with her child. In ending the life, she is placing herself in the place of the Creator. She or her partner are seeking control, not just over their own lives, but the life of their offspring. She cannot see beyond her personal goals or her suffering. Just like I argued in my video about the movie Annihilation, when we focus inward upon ourselves, we breed nihilism, and we self-destruct. I'll get into that more in just a moment. There can be no greater tragedy than for a woman to destroy the fruit of her womb, to go against the very thing that her body is designed to do, that makes her unique. When Eve had her first child, She delighted in her ability to co-create a new human with God. She says, "With the help of the Lord, I have brought forth a man," in Genesis 4:1. She basked in her feminine capacity to conceive and birth new life. A mother normally perceives no higher calling than to lay her life down, to sacrifice herself so her children can prosper. But the enemy, who hates our capacity to procreate, because that's the one thing he cannot do, he cannot create. So he has convinced us that the best thing for us to do is to sacrifice our children for our own benefit and prosperity. A woman's self-interest has been divorced from her ability to birth and nurture life. We think that those are exclusive, mutually exclusive concepts. Now, what does it mean to suffer? We get suffer from the French souffrir, to bear, to endure, allow, which comes from the Latin roots sub, which is under, and ferere, or fer, which is to bear or carry. In other words, to undergo. The Latin sufferere means to carry, even to bear children. The Greek word is pathos, which also means emotion. So when we combine pathos and gen, to birth, we get pathogen, which is a root of illness. It means that suffering stems from birth. Or it can also be said that life is suffering, or is characterized by suffering. John Vervaeke, University of Toronto professor in psychology, he reminds us that suffering is a loss of agency.
Suffering, people usually hear pain, distress when they hear the word suffering. That person is suffering. But that's not actually what the word means. To suffer means to undergo. It means to lose agency. So you can actually suffer joy. Now, pain is a very powerful way of losing agency. Why? First of all, it's highly disruptive. And secondly, pain is associated usually with damage, and damage is a state in which we're often losing agency. So, right? Don't hear just pain.
And this really fits with the etymology. It is not just referring to pain. We can suffer pain just as well as we can suffer joy, so long as there is a loss of agency or freedom. Think of tickling. When you're laughing, you're having fun to some extent, but you have no control. You have no freedom, no agency. Of course, we associate suffering with pain because pain is highly destructive and disruptive, and it's caused by damage, which could powerfully cause a loss of freedom. Interesting. Remember, the Latin can mean to bear children, implying that pregnancy involves a loss of agency. The same with aging and decay. What we dread about aging is the loss of functionality, and thus freedom, and lost opportunities as we come closer to our ultimate expiration. This absolute disdain for suffering, for carrying the burden of things outside of our control, leads us to the third topic, antinatalism. Antinatalism may be more obscure to most people. I first heard of it just a couple years ago when I stumbled across a debate between Jordan Peterson and the South African antinatalist philosopher David Benatar. Now, Benatar starts with the premise that life has more bad, whether it's pain, ignorance, malevolence, than good. Therefore, he considers it cruel to bring new sentient life into existence. So he wishes that people would just stop breeding, not just humans, but even animals. Listen to his argument and hear how much disdain he has for existence. But remember, if suffering is the loss of agency, then it's really not the pain of life that repulses him, No amount of pleasure and good in life is enough to change his mind. It's the loss of control that bothers him. That is pride, which is how the serpent appealed to us to originally sin. And like I said, the intense self-focus always leads to nihilism, because we make an idol out of self. Remember, humanity is a finite icon of an infinite God who alone can fulfill us. But when we direct our longing for the infinite toward the finite, toward the icon becomes an idol. And when we ultimately realize that the idol cannot satisfy our longings, we despise it. Therefore, pride gives birth to resentment and nihilism. He doesn't admit it, but his philosophy is incredibly nihilistic. And what is nihilism? It is the doctrine of negation. The Latin root nihil, for nothing at all, showing that the supreme value is non-existence. Just watch some of that debate and you can see how Benatar's intolerance of suffering leads him to preach that all sentient life should cease.
My point is about bringing somebody into existence. So you're contemplating now, or somebody's contemplating bringing a child into existence, and you know that in the course of the life that that child will lead, it will have more bad than good in its life, and that the amount of bad will be pretty significant. There'll be lots of bad in that life. And you're objecting to my drawing the inference that it is wrong to bring that person into existence.
I can give you a very direct example of that. And I don't know if this is a fair move, but we'll go with it. I have a child who's been very ill and who's suffered tremendously. And I think I'm more familiar with that than most people. And there were times during her life where I would say that her suffering had reached the point of being sufficiently unbearable so that it posed a threat to her continued mental health. And so for me, none of this argument is abstract or academic. But I would say three things. First is that I know with certainty that if you asked her whether her existence to date has been something that she would repeat, her answer to that would be yes.
So that I think rests on a confusion between the case where somebody already exists and the case where somebody doesn't. So if we take your daughter, for example, who does already exist, there's an identifiable person there. There's somebody with whom you're connected, for whom you have this love. And I think when you ask yourself, should she have been brought into, do you imagine her no longer being there? I think what you're imagining is her vanishing as opposed to never being. Because when you ask that question that you posed to me, like, do you love the child? Well, I think that obviously if there's an existing child, you'll want it to continue living so long as continued living is in its interests. But if you're imagining prospectively, you say, I'm going to have this child, and whatever it might be or whoever it might be, I'm going to love it. Should I have it? I think the answer to that question is going to be no, because if I care about the interests of that future potential person, and there's going to be more bad in that child's life than there's going to be good, I must avoid that child's life like the plague. I must avoid it coming into existence, and I must do so out of love. It's indecent to suggest that you would bring into existence a being that would then have to face these challenges, when there's absolutely no reason from that being's point of view why you should bring it into existence in the first place. So the voluntary confrontation with tragedy and malevolence that you speak about, that's voluntary for the person that already exists. They exist, they find this world around them, and now they voluntarily confront it in one way rather than another way. But nobody is voluntarily confronting existence per se, in the sense of having chosen to exist. That's something that's imposed on us by others. And I'm asking why we justified in making this imposition. I think if we agree, as we are for the sake of argument, that there's more bad in life than good, why would you possibly create a being that then has to confront that?
Well, it's funny that the way that you phrase the question shows implicitly the manner in which you expect and structure the answer. You said, well, why would we impose the necessity of being on someone who hasn't chosen it? You might say, well, I could also rephrase the question and say, well, it's an offer of an opportunity rather than an imposition of a dreadful fate. I mean, the fact that you regard it as an imposition of a dreadful fate in the manner in which you posed the question indicates that the conclusion is implicit in the premise. Like, I have a granddaughter now, and I would say, well, she's been offered the opportunity to exist. And you'd say, well, no, that was inflicted upon her, but that begs the question. Well, I wouldn't say it was inflicted upon her.
So when you want to show the conditions where it is warranted to bring the child into existence, the way you justify that is by telling me what that child will do with its life. So if it faces its life and it faces it well and it confronts the tragedy well, that somehow that justifies having brought it into existence in the first place. And that is to argue from the perspective of somebody who already exists. That is a different kind of decision from one where you're bringing somebody into existence. Now, you've asked.
Well, I would also say, here's another way of looking at it. So let's say you bring a new child into being, and you pledge, having done so, to teach that child how to deal properly with the unbearable lightness of being. And you teach them that the appropriate approach to malevolence and tragedy is to confront it forthrightly, to bear up under the tragedy and to restrict the malevolence. And then, as a consequence of that, you help engender someone who's not only good for themselves in their own life, but who lives as a, let's say, a beacon to others in the light in the darkness, so that the sum total of suffering in the world is dramatically reduced as a consequence of their behavior. That's a high probability event if you're careful and fortunate about how you conduct yourself in relationship to that child.
And I don't think that somebody who would bring a child into existence, at least voluntarily, would be the sort of person who would be adequately sensitize the child to the horrors of existence. What I'm saying is, if you do something to somebody, and in this case it's creating a being that is going to cause a vast amount of suffering to that being, you don't justify that by coupling it with some kind of education to help it cope with that suffering. You can never compensate for the harm done by providing some educational adjunct.
I'd like to object to that momentarily and ask you to address the issue I brought up about the person who's friendless and familyless and who no one loves or cares for. Is it therefore appropriate while they're asleep to euthanize them? And if not, why not? They're not even going to know that it's happened. And if their life is characterized by unbearable suffering, and the appropriate action is that they should never be, and you're not going to cause anyone any undue misery by eradicating them from existence, then aren't you morally obligated to do it?
Okay. So you've got this friendless person who's asleep, and is it wrong to kill him?
No. Do you have a moral obligation to kill him, given your argument? It's stronger than that.
No, I don't. I don't have a moral obligation at all.
Okay, why not?
Precisely why? I'll tell you why. Because I think that person, because he already exists, has an interest in continuing to exist. And if you were to kill him, albeit in his sleep, you're going to be thwarting that interest.
Well, what's the interest?
The interest is in continuing to exist.
Why does that interest exist? If existence is fundamentally flawed, then how in the world could the person have an interest in continuing to exist?
There's an ambiguity. When you say existence is fundamentally flawed, there's an ambiguity between coming into existence and ceasing to exist. So here's the tragedy that I think humans confront. We've got no interest in coming into existence. But once we do, we've got an interest in continuing to exist. Humanity will come to an end at some point, and so will sentient life in general. And I think that it will be good when there are no sentient beings left, although I am concerned about how they cease to exist. All I can hope to achieve in the short run is for certain people to see the force of the antinatalist arguments and for themselves to desist from procreation, not to bring further beings into existence. That would be further human beings, but also not to breed animals that were going to suffer unspeakably.
My fundamental objection is that the doctrine is deeply, deeply nihilistic and anti-human, and that it is precisely the sort of doctrine that undermines the kind of faith in being that it's necessary for people to manifest in order for them to live forthrightly and nobly and properly in the world. And I think it's terribly dangerous in that regard. And I don't think that David has done a decent job at all of addressing the fundamental objection to the antinatalist argument, which is the idea that being is somehow flawed beyond redemption, let's say, which I think is the fundamental answer. There are modes of being that redeem being, and the mode of being that redeems being is voluntary heroism in the face of tragedy and malevolence, and that lifts up being and ennobles it. And even if that's not the mode of action that characterizes most people, it's a potential mode of action, and it's the mode of action that is the proper move forward towards redemption rather than the cessation of being itself. And I would say that's the fundamental religious conundrum that's plagued mankind since the beginning of time. Life is suffering and rife with malevolence. What do you do about that? Well, one answer is cease to exist or cease existence itself. The other is to heroically confront the problem of being and to lift up the tragedy of the world on your shoulders and to move forward in a courageous manner and to redeem being as a consequence of your actions. And I think and it's not a matter of educating people to do that. It's not some manipulation of the manner in which they view the world. It's the freeing of the part of their spirit that's so powerful and so strong that it can withstand the tragedy of being and its malevolence without suffering beyond their capacity and without becoming corrupt. And I would also say that that's the core idea that underlies Western civilization itself, which is that the individual, say, made in the image of God, has sufficient intrinsic nobility of spirit to withstand the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune and to prevail. And that's a positive good, not a mere medication for an intolerable disease. And the fact that what would you say, I oppose the antinatalist position is because I think it's pessimistic, fatalistic, and fundamentally existentially cowardly, because it doesn't, and it's anti-human in that it denies the fact that the human spirit has the capacity to grapple with being, even given clear apprehension of all its intrinsic horrors. In Faust, for example, in Goethe's Faust, the character Mephistopheles essentially makes an antinatalist argument. He says that the conditions of being are so unbearable that it would be better if being never existed at all. And Goethe outlines the consequences of Mephistopheles' position, and they're dreadful. He's Satan himself, essentially, in the Faust story.
Throughout the debate, Benatar by default rejects any arguments that appeal to God or religion. This hints at a truth. Nihilism and antinatalism are the inevitable results of a philosophically consistent atheism. If there is no afterlife, no God, no objective morality, then there is no justification for life itself. Any argument we make for life having meaning is ultimately arbitrary then. So what does Theology of the Body offer us as a perspective on suffering? Well, as we'll see, Jordan Peterson was on the right track. Existence is an opportunity. If it's an opportunity bestowed upon us, not an opportunity we create ourselves, then that means that our very lives are gifts. They are products of God's self-gift of creating us in His image for our own sake. We have innate value because of our creation in God's image. And we can find our true identity only through the sincere gift of self. We do not find our identity through inward self-focus, but through loving self-giving. But with the understanding of gift comes the recognition of the Creator creature distinction. Here, I will let Christopher West explain it. This is part 1 of a reflection series he was doing on his YouTube channel on a book by Father Jacques Philippe.
Please raise your hand if you asked to exist. Please raise your hand if you had anything to do with you coming into existence. Think about this. You didn't used to exist. You do now. And you had nothing to do with it. This means your existence and my existence is a total, sheer, gratuitous gift. This means we are not our own makers. This means we are dependent, whether we like it or not, we are dependent on our maker. This is what Jesus is getting at when he says, apart from me, you can do nothing. Well, original sin itself is the rebellion of the creature against the creator. The creature doesn't want to be a creature because we believed the lie that God is against us. We're going to look at this. We're going to look at this throughout. This is where we fundamentally lose our peace, believing that God is against us. We can only be at peace as creatures if our creator is for us. This is the journey we're going on. As Jacques Philippe himself says, we'll get to this later, but he says that the whole journey of the spiritual life is a slow, painful re-education in learning that God is trustworthy, learning that it's okay to be creatures before him. It's okay to be in a posture of dependence on the creator because the creator is dependable. We often have to experience failures, trials, humiliations permitted by God before this truth really settles into our hearts, before we can really accept, apart from you, I can do nothing. Now listen to this. He says, God would spare us these trials if he could. But these trials are necessary in order that we should be convinced of our complete powerlessness to do anything on our own, right? Here I think the theology of the body shines a particular bright light on our creaturely status, right? So let's just go through a couple basic principles of theology of the body. Our bodies, as male and female, tell a divine story. And everything that is true of male and female is an analogy or a parable of the relationship between God and us. So let's look at the theology of the male body. The theology of the male body is one of giving the seed that brings new life. The theology of the female body is that of opening to receive that seed, to conceive that life, right? Here we have a profound lesson of what it means to be human in relation to our creator, right? In the spousal analogy, God is always the bridegroom, and humanity, all of us, male and female, we are always the bride. Why? Because God is the one who gives the gift of life. And we as creatures, male and female, we are the ones as creatures who must open to receive that gift of life. And that female posture, that feminine posture before the creator is only threatening to us if our creator is not love, if our creator is a tyrant, if our creator is not dependable. What are we after here? We're after receiving God's grace, receiving God's peace, receiving God's life into our life. And the model par excellence of this receiving God's grace and life and peace is Mary. Pregnant Mary is the model of the Christian life. Literally, she has God in her. She has Christ in her. This is our goal, to have Christ in us. This is how we find and maintain our peace, coming to a place of recognizing it is good that I'm not God. It is good that I'm not in control. It is good that I can't fix the world's problems. It is good to be a creature because our Creator is sheer love.
We resist existence when we don't believe that our Creator is loving and good. We close ourselves off to life in an attempt at self-protection and self-assertion. We may be choosing death, but at least we're the ones choosing it. We want that control. Notice the contrast with the worldview of people who advocate for antinatalism, infanticide, and euthanasia. For one, David Benatar is just in utter denial of our innate drive to procreate. Now, a Darwinist would say each creature has an interest in propagating its own genetic code. But why? That seems to imply some type of consciousness in each creature or a hardwired program. It doesn't explain why each creature doesn't just care about its own survival and comfort and leave it at that. Why on earth do we care about a generation we may never really fully enjoy participating in? See, this is not a question a materialist can answer. It is a theological problem. See, creatures will always strive to procreate because we are created to reflect God. We are created in the image of a procreative God who is self-giving love. See, not only is life a gift, but He has made each one of us to be gifts. We are acting at our truest identity when we join in union as total gifts of self that produce more gifts of life. Antinatalism and abortion aim to thwart that purpose. Next, we need a proper understanding as the creature, or else we fall prey to the serpent's lie that we're meant to be God, or be like Him in equality. And that is the role we falsely try to take on when we place ourselves as the arbiter of life and death. God is the only author of life. He is the master storyteller. Therefore, He alone has the right to determine when a soul enters this life and when a soul passes from this life to the next. What makes suffering is precisely the loss of agency, of freedom. It's the negation of goodness over which we have no control. But who does have sovereignty over suffering, even if He is not the cause of it? God. And in His sovereignty, He provides us a choice in how we face the suffering and malevolence of this life. We can have the attitude of defiance, or we can seek meaning in the suffering. So how does God bring meaning out of our suffering? As a therapist, I have to wrestle with this with my clients. Just today, I had 2 clients who just have histories of chronic illness, and they're in constant pain, and they've dealt with so many losses. How can they find meaning in the midst of that suffering? Check out this clip from the Ask Christopher West podcast.
Does sickness in the body relate to anything spiritually?
We can say all suffering and death and disease can be traced back to the entrance of sin into the human story. We cannot say, remember the scene in the gospel, well, why is he born blind? He was born blind because of this sin, or he was born blind because of his parents' sin. And Jesus says, no, you cannot say that. He was born blind, and then here's the glory. You want to share it?
That the glory of God might be revealed through him.
That the glory of God might be revealed through him.
Yeah, well, isn't that an awesome connection of something spiritual,
Yes.
the glory of God, with our suffering or with sickness? I think also sickness can be a spiritual opportunity.
Yes.
Because it causes us to experience our need or our weakness, which is a gift to us so that we can recognize our need for God. So, there's that positive, like just how God uses it for good in our lives. I don't know if there are any other things you want to add.
This just came to me as you said that. I think this is very appropriate to make this connection, that physical suffering, physical illness, disease, even death itself can be seen as a remedy for our spiritual sickness, because it can wake us up to who we really are and our real need and dependence on the Lord. Mm-hmm. If we could look at it as such, and we're not saying we should not therefore seek remedy to our physical sickness. We're not saying that. But we should, in all of our trials, and sickness is a big one. Mm-hmm. Death is the biggest one. Mm-hmm. In all of that, we should be looking for what the Lord is saying to us, why he's allowing it, and how that can work for the good, as you were saying. Because all things work for the good for those who love the Lord. Mm. That is hope. You know, Wendy, very well that I've been wrestling lately with aging, because we're aging. When we were always aging. But you can
were always aging. I like that point.
Yeah, but you can kind of ignore it when you're in your 20s, because it doesn't really have much of an effect. But when you're hitting your 50s, you kind of start recognizing it a lot more. And it's been a constant source of reflection for me, and has been also an opportunity for deep growth for me. Mm-hmm. A much deeper trust in the Lord's plan, that this way that we're on, this long and winding road towards death, is the road to glory. It's the road to glory.
Okay.
That's pretty exciting.
Yeah.
So not only does God assure us that he takes our suffering and brings glory out of it, but he bore our suffering himself. Jesus came as the suffering servant. He models to us the path of voluntarily bearing suffering, which is a paradox because suffering means loss of agency, but Jesus is freely choosing to bear it in order to bring life and order out of death and chaos. But ultimately, we cannot bear the burden of all of our suffering. So he's more than a model. There's an element in which he models to us how we are to live and bear suffering voluntarily ourselves. But there's also him telling us to cast our burdens on him, to nail our sin and suffering upon his cross. He gave us his all, because the reality is we cannot bear it all. As it says in Hebrews, we do not have a high priest, a mediator between us and God, who cannot relate to our brokenness and pain. In fact, no one has experienced greater suffering than Jesus. From eternity, all he's known was constant loving communion with the Father and the Holy Spirit. But on that cross, bearing the sins and sickness of the whole world throughout all of history, past, present, and future, every sin that would ever be committed, every pain ever felt, he cried out in agony as he sensed a separation between him and his Father. You can find no greater suffering than that. And so the suffering we experience in this life is just a taste of the suffering that he's experienced. And that he experiences as he walks with us. He is so in tune with his creation that he feels all the pain that we feel. As Paul says in Philippians 3, 10-11, our highest form of dignity is not control and being above all the pain and suffering. No, our highest form of dignity is Christ-likeness, to identify with Christ in his suffering. It says, I want to know Christ and the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of sharing in his sufferings, becoming like him in his death, and so somehow to attain to the resurrection of the dead. When we suffer in this life, we can take solace in knowing that our suffering mirrors Christ and enables us to be drawn into his heart. We can then relate to him in a deeper way than ever. But with the suffering, with the death, comes a resurrection. And in so doing, our agency, our freedom, is redeemed so that we can live a new life in him. This is the story of Christ, and it's the story of Christianity, the story of every Christian as well, all together. So we don't mourn like those who have no hope. In fact, we are saved in hope. We can consider our trials in this life, which is just a vapor anyway, to be light and momentary sufferings that will fade away. And so we are saved in hope. We hope in the resurrection and redemption of our bodies. Though life is rife with suffering and tainted by malevolence, we can face it with courage because of the joy that awaits us. The joy of our new glorified bodies. The joy of the marriage feast with our true love. The one who would go to hell and back for us. That's the passionate, suffering love of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Alright, that's all I got for today. If you could, make sure to hit that like button, share it, subscribe. If you're on YouTube, hit that bell for notifications, and help fight that YouTube algorithm that does not like me. Alright, God bless.